So just quick introductions. My name is Alexi. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Outreach for Diversify Our Narrative, and I'm going to be one of your moderators today.
Hi, my name is Yuan, and I'm the Executive Director at Detester, and I'm also going to be moderating the event.
Okay, we'll just get straight into just some quick introductions of our organizations and kind of what we do and what we work with.
So Detester Magazine is a youth-led nonprofit dedicated to amplifying BIPOC youth activism that affects BIPOC communities and socio-political issues around the world. And we do a lot of publications and panel like this, and also educational resources.
And so Diversify Narrative is also a student-led nonprofit. We fight anti-racism through education and encourage dialogues on race and identity amongst our student bodies. We also advocate for educational policy change to have more diverse education in the classroom. And then we'll just let our speakers introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Rohan. I use he, his pronouns. I'm a junior at Greenwich High School in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I'm a writer from Detester Magazine.
Hello, my name is Susanna, and my pronouns are she or her, and I am a senior at McGee Secondary School in Canada. I'm a writer at Detester Magazine.
Hi guys, my name is Judy. I use she, her pronouns. I am a first year at the University of Chicago, and I am the Director of Education for Diversify.
Hi, my name is Elliot Williamson Diaz. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior at Bard High School Early College Manhattan, and I'm an editor for Detester Magazine.
So just like a quick breakdown of our agenda. So we're going to start with Rohan talking about his personal experiences with social justice and social activism writing, and he'll get us started on that.
Hi, everyone. So I'd like to talk for a little bit about my writing experience and how to approach writing about social justice topics. Next slide, please. So I'm sure a lot of us can relate to the fact that getting started is probably one of the hardest parts. Maybe you have an idea, but you don't know how to put it on paper, or maybe you're trying to find an idea. So first, I want to talk about getting inspiration from everyday things. And so it can be something as simple as brushing your teeth, for example, but trying to tie in a topic that you have in your mind into something that happens to you in your everyday life, or even trying to find inspiration from that allows you, it creates automatically creates like an accessible narrative, and it allows anyone to write because these certain everyday things happen to anyone. As well, it helps you to create a strong connection with the writing as you yourself experience what you're writing about. Hello. Or what you're connecting your topic to.
Hello.
As well, another way that could you go back to the previous slide, please? Yeah. As well, another way I like to get started with my writing is if I hear a standout phrase. And so a standout phrase can be like a cool set of words, maybe you hear it on the street, or like maybe you see it somewhere online, and kind of just like taking that phrase and running with it. So like think about how it makes you feel, or how you can tie it into like a topic that you're passionate about, and just try writing and seeing where it goes. So a lot of getting started has to do with just thinking of two things of connecting your topic to something in your everyday life or a phrase that you hear in your head and just writing it out and seeing where it goes. And remember that your audience is going to be only you, so there's nothing to be afraid of in terms of just trying to put your ideas down on paper and see where it takes you. So another important thing to consider is perspective. First of all, you should ask yourself who is narrating. So if you're writing a nonfiction piece, for example, and you yourself are going to be the narrator or you're lending your voice to the piece, one, you should research to understand the perspective of those you're representing and acknowledge when you're not the expert. And as well, you should also tie in personal experience to lend yourself credibility. And tying in personal experience will not only help you connect more with what you're writing about, but it makes you see more knowledge. It makes you appear more knowledgeable on the topic, as this is something that you yourself can write about first because you've experienced it firsthand. As well, if you're taking a more fictional approach and you're creating a character within your piece, then try to create a character that embodies the ideas or issues you want to discuss, as it makes it easier for a reader to be able to connect with what you're writing about as they follow the character through your piece. Thirdly, and I think this is an important one, is word choice. So you should pay attention to the descriptors and adjectives that you're using in your piece, and specifically pay attention to connotation. So connotation means whenever you hear a word, do you think of something positive or negative? So maybe you can use a thesaurus, or just when you're revising your piece, you read through it again, and when you encounter like a descriptor and you find yourself thinking something negative, you should try and consider alternatives to that word. For example, one example of this could be describing senior citizens as having canes, as people with canes, can be somewhat disrespectful and have a negative connotation, as canes are viewed as like a crutch and something that people rely on. So it paints senior citizens as being weak. But saying senior citizens are people with wisdom, it's a better way to describe them, as it maintains a respectful tone and it keeps things positive and paints them and paints the people you're writing about in a better light. So this ties in the next point, which is staying respectful, and you should read through your piece when you're taking another look at it and understand, try and think about how your characters and ideas are presented. So if you're taking a stance on the topic, try and stay positive, or counter negatives with positives. So you don't want to attack the opposition too much. You should try and mitigate that by explaining why maybe your side of the issue is a better side. Lastly, I'd like to talk about a personal approach that I use to social justice writing, which is poetry. And now poetry is effective because it's inherently emotion driven, and that immediately helps you connect to your audience better. As well, it's also effective because it helps you create concise thoughts, as poetry tends to be a much shorter form of writing. It concentrates your language and helps your ideas become more impactful. So one thing that you should consider when you're trying to write poetry is using hard-hitting, memorable language and using words that have impact and you think will leave an impact on your reader. So you shouldn't be afraid to be bold and use strong words. And I guess a good example of this that from a current event, if people are familiar with the U.S. presidential inauguration from this year, Amanda Gorman presented a poem that she wrote, and she really exemplified the use of using hard-hitting language and powerful words. So if you're not familiar with it, you can search her up on YouTube, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. And as well, using metaphors and imagery in your work help you connect you to the subject. And tying back to an earlier point, you can create imagery using everyday things in your life, or just thinking about emotions that you have relating to the issue you're writing about. and trying to form that into an image, and what do you visualize when you're writing?
So hello everyone, my name is Susanna, and I'm just turning off my video because my Wi-Fi is horrible. So I hope this will make my voice go smoother. Okay, so I'm here to share some of my experiences of working with everyone at Detester on the articles I published. Okay, so one of my teachers told me that writing is really about three things: clarity, economy, and grace. While these can apply to any form of writing, I interpret it as asking myself three questions when working with social justice. Am I getting my point across? Am I saying it concisely and efficiently? Am I maximizing the power of words to emphasize my point? I will not be talking about clarity as much because it mainly involves the basic conventions of writing, such as grammar. Instead, I want to discuss more about balancing economy and grace in my writing. And also, as an amateur writer, I think there are two types of social justice works: one that advocates and one that educates. Those that advocate are persuasive, with an urgent and strong opinion, while those that educate mainly focus on conveying information and raising awareness around a specific issue. The proportion of economy and grace will vary depending on which one I am writing. I will talk more about this later. So first, let's talk about economy. My first pieces of writing are averaged to be 3,000 words long, which just say something about how hard I struggle with this. But now I think a good piece of writing should convey the necessary information in the most efficient way possible. A useful way of thinking about this is to think of the word count, usually 1,000 to 2,000 words as the budget, and every word you use as the money. But a lot of pieces, including some of my own, are long not necessarily because the author is being wordy, but rather because the information included are more selective. So for example, one of my pieces centered around the unique mental health struggle faced by African Americans. As for every other social justice topics, I had to ensure that my information was absolutely correct. So which, unfortunately for my editors, it resulted in a comprehensive but very tedious article that is 15 pages long. So one of my mistakes was that I dumped every single piece of information I find into it. While it is very important to research thoroughly before you write, it is equally important to know that no one wants to read a piece longer than 3 pages long. Well, unless it's for school. So as writers, it is our job to make sure that we understand the topic inside and out, but also to carefully select the information so that our readers can understand the urgency of this issue without reading a factual article. I like to think that as we're trying to raise awareness or advocate, we want to inspire our readers to read about, to care more about and do more research on the topic rather than to just bombard them with every single piece of information we can find. Just to put it into context, my pieces went from being around 3,000 words to 1,500. While it is shorter, I like to think that it is no less powerful and informative. One of my recent feedbacks was that my reader had read my piece twice because it was, she said it was amazing. That would definitely be impossible if my articles are still 3,000 words long. So moving on to grace, or I like to think it's the art of the writing. When I first started writing about social justice, I didn't care whether my writing is beautiful at all. I thought that as long as it is informative, it'll be fine. But I didn't realize that writing about social justice is still a form of artistic activism. The power of my piece really depends on how artistically and creatively I use my words. A particularly graceful sentence can send chills down my spine and makes me just think that, wow, this is really important. So for example, One of my first attempts to improve my writing's grace is a narrative-like scenario in my articles about the police response to mental health crises. The piece became the first of mine to receive feedback about how it is moving rather than just informative. So since then, I began to experiment with more artistic elements in my writing, including deliberate word choices, figurative devices, rhetorical questions, and more poetic sentence structures, and even graphics. And also, I just want to note that sometimes using sarcasm can be really powerful, but I will be cautious and limit the use of humor in general, just because most social justice topics are really sensitive. And a major purpose of social justice writing is, as I've mentioned before, is to bring the readers to care. And I've just been amazed by how much my readers appreciate it when I employ words with creativity to accentuate my stance. And lastly, bringing grace into your writing doesn't necessarily mean more complicated words and complex sentences. For example, when I want to express urgency, I might choose to just rapid fire a series of choppy rhetorical questions. It might not appear graceful, as you might think, but it really elevates your language's power on a grander scale. Now, the real issue when writing about social justice is really how to balance the two elements. When I personally write articles to raise general awareness on an issue, so one that educates, I think economy is more important than grace, just because there isn't usually a very strong central opinion, but a lot of a lot of information. Whereas in articles that advocate for a specific stance, I try to incorporate more grace to really make my words shine. However, it is essential to know that these are all based on a very solid foundation of clarity. Your message must be already clear before you can start to really elevate it. So it can be said that about 50% of my emphasis is on clarity, while I try to fiddle around with different proportions of economy and grace within the rest 50%. So if there is one thing to take away from my presentation, it would be to not be afraid to experiment with different proportions of grace and economy in your writing. I know that sometimes the topics are really serious and the amount of research is just daunting. And it is hard to really grasp onto your creativity while you're trying to squeeze all the statistics in. But as I've discovered from my personal experience, reaching an appropriate balance becomes easier with practice. So yeah, this concludes my presentation. And I hope that my experiences can inspire some of you to experiment and really have more fun as artists as well as change makers.
Well, hi guys. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specificities on how to sort of approach actually social justice writing. So next slide. So just a little bit more about me. I am Diversify Narratives Director of Education. So that means that I'm in charge of all the educational content on our Instagram. So my job really entails leading our content creator department in writing content surrounding social justice, anti-racist issues for our social media platforms. So this job requires extensive research, knowledge of current events, and really the ability to simplify and effectively communicate information to our audience members. But I don't just have to do this work. Anyone can do this work with the right amount of steps and the right mentality. So next slide. So essentially, there are a couple of steps towards writing educational content. The first step is to brainstorm. So what that means is to brainstorm what ideas you want to write about, use news sources, Twitter, even TikTok, Instagram, books, podcasts, all as sources of information. Another thing that I recommend is to bounce ideas off with your friends. So sort of think to yourself, like, what makes you angry? What do you wish more people knew about? And sort of use that as a starting point. Remember that no idea is too small or too big. Just remember in terms of like context and just making sure that it's relevant and that your audience members will appreciate what you write. Next slide. Okay, so step 2 is research. So essentially, once you have an idea, you want to be sure to do some research on the issue. So for instance, you want to read up on articles, studies, and any sort of information that is reputable, of course, that you can find about this issue. So another thing that's really important is that you also want to decide how you want to approach this issue. So you want to think about like what angle you want to feature. Because a lot of the work that I do centers on Instagram and Instagram infographics, we only have 10 slides to discuss an issue. And, you know, we can do multiple slides or multiple series, but in one post, we're only limited to 10 slides. So what that means is that we need to focalize the topic that we want to talk about to make sure that it's as specific and as explicit to our readers. For example, if you look at the case study of what is environmental racism is a huge issue, and it's really difficult to oftentimes explain in 10-ish slides. You can talk about air pollution, you can talk about climate change, you could talk about, you know, clean water, you could talk about environmental diversity and stuff like that. So there are a lot of things that you can talk about under the umbrella of environmental racism. So something that I recommend doing is sort of like narrowing your approach. So for example, with the recent events happening in Texas, or, you know, like a couple weeks ago with the snowstorm and people being left, you know, without power, without electricity, without water, or like warm water, you can kind of create a post that's like, what's going on in Texas and why does it disproportionately affect BIPOC? So what that does is that even though you have a larger issue of environmental racism, it sort of narrows your focus down to a current events issue, and B, it also connects to larger implications that affect the BIPOC community, which is what you really want to talk about here. Next slide. Yeah, so once you get to your researching, you kind of have this idea, you have some data and stuff like that, you want to actually write. But before you write, you want to outline. Outlining is really important. I do it for all my papers in high school and in college now. And you definitely want to outline your post. So you want to kind of include what topics you want to cover and how you want to communicate these topics effectively to your audience. So you want to think to yourself, if I was someone reading an infographic on this issue, what information would I want to know that would help me? So for instance, if we were to use the case study of what's going on in Texas and why does it disproportionately affect BIPOC, you would want to start out with kind of just, you know, a recap of the events that are happening in Texas, why it's, you know, like what percentage of people it's affecting, how many people are being affected by it. And then you kind of want to go deeper into talking about the history of like certain districts or places in Texas that receive poor infrastructure or don't receive proper funding in order to, you know, create like sustainable power lines to keep their lights on. And so you kind of want to go deeper and you want to think about the things that you want to bring out in the post in your outlines. And so once you have your outline, you can then write your post. And you want to always make sure to cite your sources, make sure to give credit where credit is due. And I guess in terms of length, you would want it to be no more than, I guess, 2 smallish paragraphs per slide. It's better to have more slides and less content on each slide than less slides and more content, because that way it's digestible and easy for the readers to look at and to also understand. Next slide. Yeah, so once you've, you know, written a draft of, say, like what's happening in Texas and why does it disproportionately affect people of color, you really want to make sure to send your post to someone else to look over. When I write a post or something, I'll send it to the other people in my department to read it and to, you know, make notes and to make edits and to really make sure that my content is as good as it can be. So getting multiple pairs of eyes on a topic, especially if the topic is sensitive, is really, really important. And additionally, if you are writing a topic that discusses an issue from a certain community and you're not part of that community, you should definitely have someone from that community read it to make sure that your language is correct and appropriate and you're, you know, encompassing their experience in a very respectful and educational manner. And you also want to remember that language is very, very important, especially when it comes to these very sensitive and, topics that deal with people's identities or the suppression of people's experiences. So, for example, capitalizing the B in Black, thinking about America versus the United States, and you want to use the United States because when we refer to America, we're referring to the United States, but there's actually, America is not just the US. There's other parts of North, Central, and South America that are not the US. And so when we say the word America instead of the United States, we're kind of reinforcing these like colonialized mindsets or colonized mindsets. And we kind of want to, definitely move away from that. So just remember that language is really important. Next slide. Yeah, so finally, you want to make sure to monitor your post. So you've written it, you've edited it, you've peer reviewed it, you've sourced it, and now it's up on Instagram or it's up on your social media platforms or it's up on your website. So once you post it, you want to make sure to monitor the comments. Oftentimes we've had posts in which we have messed up on like a language part of one part and a comment pointed it out. Or for example, we had a post that, was predominantly red-green colors and people who are red-green colorblind had issue, seeing the post. And so we want to make sure that the comments, if they reveal something about the post that is problematic, we either change it in the caption to reflect the comment, or we take the post down and we repost it with the correct language and terminology. You always, always, always want to make sure that you're representing the communities that you're talking about accurately, respectfully, and educationally. So a way to do that, a really good way to do that is to monitor at least the constructive comments in your Instagrams, because sometimes, our Instagram gets a lot of hate comments from people who are really mean. And so when it comes to those comments, we don't really look at them. But when it comes to the comments that matter, we do. So next slide. Yeah. So ultimately, don't worry. It's okay to make mistakes. Writing educational content, especially when it comes to covering issues that are sensitive and controversial, is very difficult. But remember to correct your mistakes, recognize the harm being done if there was harm done, apologize, learn your lesson, and do better. Remember that this work is very difficult to navigate, but it is deeply fulfilling. And it's one of my favorite parts of being in Diversify or Narrative. And when I go to the comments and I see someone, reading about something that I wrote and saying, thank you so much, like this was so informative and this really made me look at things in a different way. It is so incredibly fulfilling. And I hope that every one of you guys get that feeling as well. So thank you guys. And I will pass it off to Elliot.
Okay, I'm Ellie. I'm an editor for Detester Magazine. I'll just say that again. So I agree with everything that all the writers have said before. And I'm really lucky to work with really amazing and passionate writers at Detester. So I'll just share some of my experience editing. Next slide. Okay, so when I'm reading an article, two of the most important questions that I ask myself or I want answered when I'm reading a piece are, why do you care? Why do you, the author, care? And why should I care? So ways to kind of weave in why do you care and answer that question for your audience is to add your own personal experience, and also share your identity and acknowledge your bias. As an editor, I think I have to work constantly whenever I'm reading a piece, editing a piece, or just kind of moving through the world. I have to acknowledge my own biases. And I think that's really important to kind of state and put it out there and show your audience your perspective on your identity and why this topic is really important to you. And then also, why should I care? A lot of the times when I'm reading a piece, I try not to read it as an editor or someone that has to read this piece, but I try to read it from the perspective of someone that just wants to learn more. So ways to answer the question of why should I care as an audience member are to bring in other interesting topics or intersecting topics, shows the importance and the urgency, but then also keeping us engaged. And next slide, I'm going to talk about more about how to keep your audience engaged and make your piece accessible. Next slide. Okay, so accessibility. When we talk about keeping your audience engaged, we make We also mean making it accessible to everyone. So this is anyone who's coming into this piece with either a lot of information that they've done research before or coming in with zero information. Everyone should be able to read your piece and understand it. So the first thing is simple language that I know a lot of the other writers have talked about. So to avoid complex vocabulary, things that may seem really clear to you may not seem clear to everyone. So I think an important thing that I had to learn, especially in my own writing, even at school, is to avoid what you think is kind of the impressive academic language. Because while you may think it's like kind of showing off, for a lot of people, it's just harder to understand. So keeping your sentences short and your vocabulary clear, I think that's one of the best ways to make sure your piece is accessible to everyone. And also hold your reader's attention. So I think shorter, clearer sentences and cutting down on paragraphs that ramble and throw a lot of information at your audience. And also asking your readers to question their own biases and perspectives. I think what Susanna was talking about, like throwing like rhetorical questions and kind of just giving your audience things to think about rather than just like huge chunks of information that can be really hard to digest. Because as she said, like no one really wants to read like a really, really long piece that they don't understand. And also, I think there's an aspect of no one wants to read something where they feel like they're missing out and that they're like not as smart as other people or they're not as informed as other people when they're reading it. So to keep it really simple. And then also tangible steps moving forward. So at the end of your piece, having like future steps, other resources to read, to watch, petitions or like things that like they can go sign like right after they read your piece, and just steps so they can like get more info and also feel and get involved. So it's not that they just read your piece and then like go on with their regular life. So giving them access to resources that like help them move forward and like get more interested in your topic. And then we can go to the next slide. Okay, yeah. So got my notes here, sorry. So role as an editor, I think this is really important to acknowledge. So my role as an editor, I have to constantly kind of remind myself that my perspective and my bias is different than from my writer. So every time I'm reading an article, a short story, a poem, or anything, I have to remember that I have a different perspective from my writer, and I should learn from their perspective, especially because a lot of these topics are very personal, and that like I have an experience. So it's like every article is a chance for me to learn, and every article is also, or short story is also a chance for me to learn more about my writer, and to kind of develop a relationship, learn their writing style. So when we're working together in the future, we have that kind of base of a relationship together. And then to review sensitive language, facts, and definitions, a lot of that is just like I'm looking up definitions, I'm making sure we're updated on like the most language, like what everyone was saying. So we're making sure we're being sensitive and we have the correct facts, like we have the correct statistics. And these are kind of a lot of the technical things, like we're citing things correctly, all sorts of that. And then also, one of the things that I think is the most important part is that if I'm confused and if I have to read a sentence like twice, then I'll just say that. I'm not going to put, because if I'm a reader, I'm not going to want to read through a sentence multiple times to try to figure it out. If I was an audience member, I would probably just like stop reading. So to make sure it's accessible to everyone and just really clear. And then something that I've had to do, like, and to work on, like, as a writer myself, is to have like other people read it. And a lot of times it's really hard to figure out what in our own writing is confusing, and to have someone else read it and accept their criticisms. Because I know I've struggled with like taking criticisms too personally. So as an editor, like if I criticize or if I comment on something, to not take it personal, that I'm not like saying you're a bad writer, but I'm saying like this piece could be improved upon. And also I think it speaks to the way our editing process kind of works at Detester, that the first round of edits, I'm not commenting on grammar, I'm not commenting on like sentence structure kind of. Most of my comments are just asking questions and saying like, what could you push this further? Could you like add more personal experience here? Can you expand on this? So that's the first round of just asking questions. And then once like we get back, we communicate about more things or how we could clarify things, then we'll kind of move to like sentence structure and like grammar and kind of like the smaller details. That just, it makes more sense. And then also like to writers, I think an important thing in building like the editor-writer relationship is for writers to not be afraid to like ask your editor what they mean by a comment or to kind of like push back on some comments, because like editors aren't always right. We're not always like, we don't know everything, especially in like poetry, to kind of push back and say like, no, I want it to keep like, I want it to say like this, or to just ask questions and be like, I have no idea what you meant by this comment. Can you explain this to me better? And then we'll kind of like, we'll work on it together. And that's really it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. So also part of this is that you do have the opportunity to get your work published. So the deadline is April 3rd at 11:59 PST, and you could submit it at the link, and we'll send that link to you all in an email with the recording of the panel at a later date.
Yeah, it's a great chance for you to have the opportunity to apply what you learned from the panel today into actual writing, and you are welcome to submit your writing that will be featured in an anthology that Detester Magazine and Diversify Our Narrative are going to publish. If you have questions about these pieces or how to get the creative work to be published or anything related to the anthology, you're more than welcome to email any of our organizations.
Mm-hmm.